achieved or that you're developing. So I actually don't like to use the phrase missile defense. In fact, I don't, except when I have to, because it's sort of developing a shield with a sword, and that's all it is. It's not about defense, it's about enhancing the destructive power of what you have, but making it impossible for somebody else to counter any part of it if you can do it. So we're very tied, and another thing that ties the two states together, there's something at Schriever called the Space Warfare Center. They've renamed it, but I still call it that. And they have actual war games, and Los Alamos would like be online, and probably Sandia and Albuquerque, when they're doing these big games, and they're games that are projected 10 or 20 years into the future. They're fighting a war after the next war, and so these labs and these bases all interconnect and talk to each other when they have these war games, and Los Alamos would always be in that picture. Now, a little bit more about the protest stuff that has come more recently. We have Jackie Hudson here in the room, and the Plowshares movement came to Colorado in 1998. And the two people who came there to do an action had very recently been to an Atlantic Life Community retreat on the East Coast. And Satyo Koyen and Daniel Seekin did a Plowshares action in 1998 at N7, which is the missile closest to N8, which became and has stayed very famous since then. So they went to trial and got some pretty harsh sentences out of it. One of the things that came out of that trial that was of special interest to me, given my interest in the Air Force Academy's relation to the nuclear war plan and execution, a couple of the young guys that were on duty at the Launch Control Center that day had only graduated from the academy a year or two before. And the guy that had a very Irish-sounding name, and if I were a betting man, I bet he was Catholic. And I never got a chance to talk to him, but this brought back again, how can the Catholic Church be so in bed with these people? It's almost like parallel universes. I mean, people really do, it sounds kind of buzzy, but I don't know how else you explain it, how people can just see things entirely differently. Somehow they train people there to see deployment in various aspects of nuclear war as just being their job. And they actually, before you get out of the academy, you have to actually address the nuclear question. That you would be willing, if ordered, to use a nuclear weapon. You have to say yes to that, or you don't get an Air Force commission. So a lot of the people doing that are Catholics every year. I mean, there have been articles in our paper, our diocesan paper, that up to 40-some% of the people at the academy are Catholic. Double, I guess, the national percentage. And I have not researched this, but I'll bet you a lot of them came out of Jesuit schools, high schools, college prep schools run by the Catholic Church. Because they do, their academic standards are pretty high out there. Because the people that don't become pilots, they go into missile technology. And increasingly, how are we doing on time here? Drone technology. They had a guy give a speech at the academy not too long ago that said within a few years, 50% of all Air Force planes would be remote control. And trying to, talk to these future leaders in that area about what they should be really preparing for. But the nukes are never left totally behind. That's the whole thing. A lot of people think, well, they make choices typically, and I brought some defense news publication that a retired colonel lets me read, but it's sort of like the ongoing talk about war development, war technology development. And it just, what was my point there? Well, about drones. I mean, that's the sort of the wave of the future. If you look at the ads in there, I find them also very instructive of this parallel universe idea. When they talk to each other, it's a whole different language, and it's all, you know, kind of sexy stuff. Well, back to the Catholic chapel for a little bit. Even in the era of the Vietnam War, some of us became aware of what the Air Force Academy chapel did. You know, by that time, by the early 70s, it was mostly a bombing war in Southeast Asia. So the people that were doing most of the killing in American uniforms were people flying airplanes. And by that time, we had a couple of sort of iffy statements by the Catholic Church, maybe raising some questions about morality of this war and whether or not it was okay. But, you know, never anything saying you got to get out of uniform, you got to quit doing this tomorrow. Never. And at the academy, in fact, they were getting another whole message. We started going to some of the services out there and looking at their hymnals and the architecture and all of the religious art in the building is really sculpted and sort of blends together nationalistic and religious symbols in a way that is, to me, just shocking. But that place is the highest tourist destination in all of Colorado, for example. So it has a tremendous power to create an image that this is all right, that this is all good with God, and it's something as Americans we ought to be proud of. So we had some protests there starting in the 70s. I think the first was 1972. 73, a small group of us in Colorado Springs began to really focus there. And at one point said we were going to have an overnight vigil at the chapel, and that didn't work. And so, and this is really true. The priest's name who came and hustled us out of there with the assistance of the cops was Roman Kaiser. One of those things you couldn't invent. You know, that was his name. So that led to it. Through the 70s, there were a series of those arrests at the chapel, trying to say this has got to be a house of God. It can't be a state-run religion building, and fighting that issue in court. And that's continued up to the present day in some form. Nobody's been arrested out there in a while. They've really tightened up, as you know, free speech zones, and the chapel area used to be clearly that, and now they want to shut it down and make a big issue out of it every time you go out there with a sign and so forth. So you have to make a plan. Well, I know I dropped the ball on the protests at Rocky Flat, or at the Minuteman silos. So we had that action in '98, and a number of other that were more like trespassing incidents. I was arrested there once with Carl Cabot, but then in 2002 we had a major plowshares action at Silo N8, which most of you know a lot about. I won't go into a lot of detail about it. But it really raised the profile of the missile field in a way that it had never been before. Not that it lasts very long. This is the problem with this issue is seemingly so easily walled off that every time we do that, we've had another thing with Carl Cabot's action at the same silo, cutting through the fence